Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here. I am Terry Abstein. I'm the Contracts and Grants Manager for the division. And today we are going to talk about all things cultural facilities. We're going to talk about the timeline and then how to do all of the things that you need to know how to do. If you have already attended or watched the how-to webinar for general program support and specific cultural project grants, there will be a bit of an overlap, but there are a lot of things that cultural facilities require that are different. And if you have managed a cultural facilities grant in the past, there may have been some changes in the last few years. And I try to point those out as we go along. So after the presentation today, a follow-up email will go out that has the link to the quiz, but I also put it in the chat feature. So the quiz is something that you are required to do as part of the first payment request. And I will, since it's just me, I'm going to do my best to monitor chat and the question box. But it might be a little bit too much for me to switch back and forth. So we may keep questions all the way to the end. In the meantime, please do feel free to ask anything you need to ask, and we will be sure to address those. Everyone is muted, video is disabled, but like I said, you can use chat and Q&A. Okay, so today's agenda is we're going to talk about the timeline. And then we're going to talk about completing the contract details form, how to access and sign your contract, completing the restrictive covenant, submitting reports, payment requests, contract amendments, and then we will address question. So first thing is the timeline. It's a good idea to go ahead and put these dates in your calendar so that you have a reminder, and I will address everything that's in the timeline in more detail later in the webinar. So the grant period officially began July 1st, 2023. So any expenditures, if you had materials you were waiting to order, you were waiting to give your contractors the go ahead and start, July 1. Feel free to carry on. Do remember that no expenditures towards the grant could be made before July 1st for the agreement. So if you started work, anything that you started ahead of time is not part of the grant. Complete your contract details as soon as possible. That goes along with downloading the agreement, uploading back up to the system, and getting your restrictive covenant recorded. So the contract does need to be signed by an authorizing official. If there's a delay to your project, the absolute final deadline to execute a contract with the division is January 31st, 2025. We don't want to wait that long, but we have until that date if something comes up and you need to postpone your project. After that date, the money gets swept and goes back to general revenue. Reporting is quarterly, and I have the dates here for when the reports are due. The first one will be due October 15th. Even if you don't have an executed contract, you do need to do the report, even if it's just to say, we haven't done anything yet. That's fine. We just like those quarterly check-ins. And I do need to fix the slide because it says January 31st, 2024. It's actually January 31st, 2025. So I'll fix that before I send these out. May 1st, 2025. Wrong date again, sorry about that. Amendments have to be crested by this date. So the grant period ends on June 1st of 2025. We ask you to request amendments for extensions at least 30 days in advance, which would bring it to May 1st. But keep in mind that if your contracts have to go through an approval process or it has to go to a commission or a council for approval, you may need some extra time in there. So maybe 60 days in advance. Just keep that in mind. And then the final report is due on July 15th, which is 45 days after the end of the grant period. Okay, so first things first, there are 2 sections in the contract, the grant award agreement, that requires you to maintain project records. So make a grant file. Make sure that you're using make sure that you have all of these things included in that, the grant award agreement, the financial documentation, deliverable documentation. If you have any external electronic storage, keep that. You have to keep it for a period of 10 years. If you have multiple grants with the division, make sure that you keep separate files for each grant. Okay, so that's your filing system. For DOS grants, you want to make sure that you're using your own account and not someone else's. Make sure that the contact information in the online grant system is correct. You can edit your own individual account profile through the account dropdown and the organizational profile through the organization dropdown. So from the organization detail page, you'll click on Manage Staff to edit users associated with your organization. You'll want to make sure that you have your UEI number. I think almost everyone does. And make sure that your fiscal year end date is correct, or that you have one. We noticed that some of those dates seem to have disappeared in the system. If it's blank, go ahead and enter that. Okay, so your grant record details page is the main hub for your grant, and it's where you're going to find payment requests, reports, the contract details, the contract itself. Everything kind of lives here. So from the grants dropdown, click on My Grants. You're going to go to your 24 cultural facilities grant, and then click on the details button on the far right. It's a good idea to bookmark this page. That way you can kind of easily access it. So the first thing you're going to do is complete your contract details form. And the contract details form is about 3/4 of the way down the page. It's under Forms and Reports, and you'll just click on Edit. So in the contract details form, it's going to explain specifically how grant and match funds will be spent for the entire grant period. It will be part of your grant award agreement or contract. I kind of use those interchangeably. And there are 4 parts: deliverables and documentation, budget, scope of work, and grant contract. So the first tab is deliverables. It is all pre-populated for you. The deliverables are standard for every grantee for cultural facilities. And this identifies the payment structure and the documentation that's required for payments. And I will talk more about that later on in our presentation. This next tab is the budget. The budget is pre-populated with the information from your application. And so here is where you have the opportunity to make any changes to account for variations in cost or to simplify the accounting process. You can add, edit, and delete lines. So if you have a line that isn't going to have any funds at all on it, it originally did, costs have gone up, so you're not going to be able to complete that part, you can just delete the line. You don't have to leave it there. If it has zeros in all 3, grant funds, cash funds, and in kind, you can just delete that line. So this example that I have here on the screen is for a grant that had a 1-to-1 match. And you can see that the grantee matched grant funds with match funds dollar for dollar. And you actually don't need to do it that way. If you have some large costs, you can lump everything into one line for your grant funds and then put all the rest of it in cash match. The two columns do not have to be equal on each side, as long as you have the full grant award amount and your full match amount. So be aware of non-allowable expenses. This list is in the grant award agreement. It's in the guideline. I'm just going to go over it really briefly. If it's not included in your scope of work, it can't be in your budget. This grant does not cover general operating expenses. It's strictly for the bricks and mortar construction part of your grant. It doesn't cover costs of writing the grant. No expenses that were outside of the grant period or either before or after, no lobbying, no planning. So nothing like surveys or soil tests or those initial design documents. You can include construction documents, but not the development part of design. Bad debts, travel, food, that kind of thing. Everything has to be open to the public, so no restricted or private or exclusive participation. You can't re-grant the funds. Nothing will be reimbursed that was done before the grant award agreement dates. And then there are some Florida statutes that talk about fixed capital outlay grants for nonprofits. But I think that for the most part, we have all of those included in our grant award agreement. But if you want to check out that statute, you're more than welcome to do that. So the third tab is the scope of work. And the scope of work is a description of what the funds will be spent on during the grant period. It should have a brief description of the project as a whole, a very simple brief description. It doesn't have to be paragraphs long. It can be a couple of sentences long. And then it should include a list of deliverables. So things that will be completed, and it should be specific. So something like this grant funds will be used to create or to renovate XYZ theater. Funds will be used to purchase new curtains, purchase new seats, install new carpet, something that simple. And it would kind of match up with what is in the budget. And then the fourth tab is contact information. So you will select the person who is going to be managing the grant for you under grantee contact. And it's a drop-down list. If the person is not on the list, that means you will need to add them. So to add a person, you will go to, this is kind of screenshots of different parts of the screen, but you're going to click on your organization name, and then it'll take your organization profile. You'll click on Manage Staff, and then you can add a new staff member, or the person that's going to be managing the grant can create their own login information and request association with your organization profile. And if you need help walking through that, I'm certainly happy to do that. So they are required first name, last name. You will need an email and you will need a work phone number. If you don't have that in the individual's profile, you'll get an error message when you select them for the contract. Okay, so you also on the contact page will need to select the address. And we actually asked for you to put the payment address. This is where a check would be mailed if you get paper checks, and the address must match the address that is on your substitute W-9. When you have all the tabs completed, you will click submit. And then I will be able to go into my queue and see that the grant details have been submitted. I will review them as quickly as I can. If there are minor changes like formatting, I will fix it. If it's a larger issue, like the budget doesn't match up, if there's something on there that wasn't in your application, I'll return it to you and get additional information. We can talk through what you had on there so that we have contract details that is appropriate and that both of us agree on. Once I approve the contract details form, it turns itself into a grant award agreement in the system. And you will be able to download it in the system. I'm going to go ahead and show you that. You'll want to make sure you obtain those signatures and upload it back into the system as soon as possible. So you'll access your contract just above where the grant record details was on your contract details page. And this is what it looks like. You can download the agreement itself from this document viewer. There's a little download button, there's a print button. And then on the left-hand side, there's a supporting documents section. That is where you will find the restrictive covenant that also needs to be signed, notarized, and recorded. So those two documents will be accessible on this page. And this is where you will upload the document once you have it signed on your end. Okay. All right, so you're going to download it from document viewer, download the restrictive covenant, sign the contract. Be sure that you include the property description in the contract. You will also need to include your current substitute W-9. If nothing has changed, just upload what you uploaded in your application. You can browse and select the thing from your document or from your computer, or you can drag and drop it as well. Drag and drop does work. Then you'll want to click save. Once you do that, it shows as being submitted. And then I can check and download what you've submitted to me and make sure everything's correct and have it executed on our end. So make sure that you obtain those signatures as soon as possible. You can print the contract and have it signed and scan it, or you can sign it digitally. If you do sign it digitally, make sure that there aren't any Adobe security features on it. If the Adobe security features are there, it restricts us from signing it on our end. So I will have to send it back to you to get that taken off. Okay, so what is in the grant award agreement? So it's a legally binding document, obviously, between you and us. And there's just pointed out some of the super important sections. Obviously, the scope of work, the deliverables, the length of the agreement, the payment structure is in it, financial consequences for not fulfilling the deliverables are in there. Basically, it says if you don't do it, you don't get the money, but they are in there. There's information about encumbrance. The reporting requirements are in there with the deadlines, extension policies, and procurement requirements. So I briefly addressed that there was a restrictive covenant that you would have to download and have signed and notarized and recorded. I want to go over what that is very quickly. It is to be filed with the county court for a period of 10 years from the date of the contract execution. And basically it ensures that the facility will continue to be used for its intended purpose for a period of at least 10 years. There is information about the restrictive covenant and a surety bond option should you choose to go that way in the agreement in clauses 18 and 20 and attachments C and D. If you want to know more about the surety bond, just contact me directly. Typically, those have a fee attached to them through your insurance. The restrictive covenant only is the cost of recording the document. So 99.999% of organizations go with the restrictive covenant. It is prepared by the division. You will have it signed and notarized on your end by your organization and the owner if the owner is different than the grantee. And then that will be filed with the clerk of county courts. And a copy of the recorded restrictive covenant is part of your first deliverable for your first payment. So we have procurement requirements in the grant award agreement. These are stipulated by the state of Florida. It's in statute. So there's procurement of goods and services that are under $35,000 for small purchases up to $2,500. It does not require competitive process and is at your own discretion. Amounts between $2,500 and $35,000 require sort of informal competitive process and can be procured by purchase order or accepting vendor proposals, that kind of thing. So anything that exceeds $35,000 has to be procured either by formal invitation to bid, request for proposals, or invitation to negotiate, and can be procured by purchase order, acceptance of vendor proposals, or other appropriate documentation. So you actually have to go through a competitive bid process for those large figure goods and services. And you need to keep a file with that process and document where you've posted it, if you put it out to the public, any kind of documentation that you ask for, proposals, keep all the documentation in your file. I do want to remind you that all of your contracts with architects or contractors do need to be reviewed and approved by the division. And I'll talk a little bit more later what we're looking for when we do that. If you already have a contract in place, make sure you send it to me so that I can make sure all of the things are in it. You may need to do an addendum, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So what I look for when I'm approving the contracts is that the scope of work is in the contract that's also in the grant award agreement. So if it's part of a larger project, the contractor or architect may need to put an addendum specifying the scope of work separately for the grant award agreement. There should be a timeline or a projected work completion date in the contract. The actual cost, you would not believe how many contracts I get that don't have any fees in them. Need to know that the entire grant award and match is encompassed in that contract or part of it. So you may have multiple contracts, which is fine. The biggest thing is the no discrimination clause. So the no discrimination clause is in the grant award agreement, and you need to make sure that is included in your contracts with contractors, architects, engineers, etc. And you can have purchase orders, vendor proposals, task authorizations, etc. And this will be submitted with your first payment request as well. Okay, so reports. Reports are quarterly. They're all done in DOS grants. Access to the grant record details page. It is in clause 11 of your grant award agreement. The first one, as I mentioned, is due October 15th. The final report is due 45 days after the end of the grant period, or 45 days after your final payment request if you finish early. So you have 45 days basically. If you finish it in 6 months, you request your last payment, you have 45 days from when you request that last payment, or if you don't finish until the very end, 45 days from when the grant period ends. If you have to extend it, you have 45 days from the end of that extension. And even if you haven't received your actual last payment, you are still required to file your final report as if the funds were received. The reports are pretty simple. You would include what work has been done. Any expenses that you've incurred will go into the expenditure log, and you can mention deliverables or work items that have been finished. The report does require at least one attachment. You can put a photograph of work that's been completed so far. You could put a contract that you were waiting to get that you finally got, anything that's kind of relevant to the project. Just as long as you submit something, it won't let you submit it without an attachment. Okay, so I mentioned you will want to include expenditures that you've incurred. You will enter those in the expenditure log. The expenditure log is also accessed from the grant records detail page. Like I said, it's the hub. You'll want to bookmark it. You'll want to click add a new record to enter a new expense. And then it pops up the box and you will enter the relevant information. So if you have an invoice number, you would put that in there. It could be a transaction number instead. You do need one or the other so that if there's an audit, we can match that up with the documentation that you have. The payment date, who it was paid to, the total amount of the transaction, and then total amount that were grant funds or match funds or in kind, which budget item it belongs to, and then a brief description. So now we're going to talk about payments. The best part, right? You've done all this work, you applied, you got the award, we did the contract details, you actually got to work. Now it's time to get reimbursed for what you've done so far. So this is done through the payment request form, which is accessed through the grant details page. Payments are in increments of 30%, 60%, and 100% completion of the project, and that's grant funds and match funds. If you have a larger project and the grant is just a small part of it, I would recommend having your budget in the grant award agreement only for your grant and match funds and not the entire project, so that you get your funds sooner. 30% of $1 million is a lot easier to come to than an $8 million project, which is your whole project. So try to narrow that down to just the grant part. And you can request more than one payment at a time. If you want to wait until the end and request the whole thing, you can do that as well. You will select the deliverable that for the payment you're requesting, fill out the invoice period, which is the beginning of the grant period. So 7/1/2023 through the day that you're requesting the payment. Upload the documentation that's required. And then you're going to click submit. You're going to review the information. It gives you a second page. You're going to review it, make sure it's correct, check the little box that certifies the payment request, and then you're going to click submit again. So if you don't click submit twice, the payment request is not complete. If you aren't already set up to get electronic funds, direct deposit, you can. The process of signing up for that is outside of the division. This form is with the Department of Financial Services. So I can't really help you with it other than to give you the form. The link is here and I can provide it to you also. I do want you to be aware that cultural facilities payments can take 8 to 10 weeks for you to get the funds, because those payments actually have to go through a budget amendment request with the governor's office. And so it does take a little bit of time to get that, but you can always check on the status of your payments in fax. And the link to fax is there as well. Okay. So when you have 30% of your project completed, you can request your first payment. The deliverables and the documentation are listed there when you go in for your payment request, and it tells you everything that you have to have. All payments require a completed application and certificate for payment, which is an AIA document G702, and a schedule of contract values, which is an AIE or AIA document 703 or the equivalent. So not every contractor uses the AIA documents. You can submit something that is its equivalent. I have some examples in some future slides. You're also required to submit documentation for all your paid expenditures. So you would include the invoice, the check, and the bank statement, or the invoice and the EBT transfer and the bank statement. So you need to have proof that you incurred the expense and proof that you paid the expense and proof that it cleared your bank. Payment 1 also requires the grant management quiz certificate. The link you will get in the follow-up email. It's also in the chat. And the contract with the architect or contractor that's already been approved by me, and proof of the funding credit acknowledgement sign. I have some examples about that in a future slide as well. And a copy of the recorded restrictive covenant. So here I have everything kind of listed that I just went over. The quiz, if you've taken it before, it's a new one this year. It's a new one every year. It has this year's dates on it. It has our new logo on it. So you will have to take the quiz again. So for all of the payment requests, you do need those G702, G703, or their equivalents. Documentation of paid expenditures for all three. Payment 3 also requires a certificate of substantial completion or its equivalent. And I'll show you some examples of those as well. So this is what the quiz looks like, the certificate that you will get automatically when you get 100 for passing the quiz. This is what AIA G702 looks like. Basically, it's an invoice that's filled out by the contractor or the architect. The AIA G703 is a listing of costs that have been expended so far. So when you get at least 30, 60, or 100% in the column that is total completion, those are the increments where you can request a payment. And it's cumulative. So every time your contractor or your architect requests a payment from you, that total would be going up because they've completed more work. So it's cumulative each time. Okay, so if they don't use those AIA documents, you can submit instead the schedule of contract values. I do have an Excel spreadsheet with this document. If you would like me to share it with you, just shoot me an email and I can provide it to you. Or your contractor or architect may use something similar to this. This is perfectly acceptable. Okay, so the first payment requires documentation of the funding credit sign. So the sign is intended to be displayed during construction. You don't have to leave it up after the project is finished. It should say on it, sponsored in part by the state of Florida through the Division of Arts and Culture, and this language is in your grant award agreement. It should be a photograph of the sign installed. And the grant award agreement does actually have some size requirements and material requirements, but it varies from project to project. A lot of folks are using vinyl signage now. It's a lot cheaper, easier to replace if you have to. And I have some other examples. So these are project signs that are included. They have our logos on them. If you would like a copy of our logo, send me an email. And we have different versions of it. We have some that are all black, all white. We have the colored ones, horizontal, vertical. We have different file formats. Whatever you need, just shoot me an email and I will share that with you. Okay, so I mentioned that the final payment request also needs to have an AIA G704 if the contractor uses it. Basically, this is saying that the project is substantially complete. If they do not use the AIA forms, you can submit an affidavit of completion. Again, I have a template for this as well. If your contractor does not have one, I'm happy to share our template with you. Just shoot me an email. Okay, so I know that was a lot. I'm sure you have questions. I tried not to go too fast, but I don't want to keep you forever either. If at any time you don't know, or when you finally get to that step and you're like, Terry, it's all blur, that's fine. Give me a call, shoot me an email, and I will be happy to review anything with you. I do want to remind you that you are required to complete the Single Audit Act certification form every year, 9 months after the end of your fiscal year. You might not necessarily have to do an actual audit because the audit depends on whether you expend $750,000 in state funds or in federal funds in a single fiscal year. So you might not reach that threshold for the audit, but you are required to do the certification form. And these certification forms are accessed through our grant system also. Don't think that I actually have any screenshots for you. So it's actually accessed on your organization profile, not the grant details page. And there will be the fiscal year that you're required to do it. You just click on it. It takes like 2 minutes. It's step by step. You just answer some questions, sign it, check a box, and you're done. Really, the simplest thing in DOS grants ever is the single audit certification. Okay, you may need to do an amendment. So you may find that costs went up and you aren't able to complete all of the items in your scope of work. So you're going to have to update your budget and alter your scope of work. You may need to extend the grant. We do grant extensions in 6-month increments. We can do multiple, so you're not just stuck with the 6 months. We can do more than one if need be, but they are only 6 months at a time. We only require a budget amendment if there is a 20% variance in grant funds, either plus or minus. So we don't take extensions and amendments lightly. You actually have to have a legitimate reason to do it. If you're like, I just don't have the matching funds and I can't finish right now, I have to raise some more funds, that's not a reason for an extension. You had to demonstrate that you had the funds when you applied. You should still have them. Before you request an amendment in DOS grants, be sure to reach out to me first so we can talk about what it is that you need to do and that I know to look for it, because I don't get a notification that it's in there. And I do consider those on a case-by-case basis. Don't forget, I mentioned try to request those extensions at least 30 days before the end of the grant period. If anything that you do, any kind of contract or amendment has to go through an approval process, if you're a city or a county, or your organization has a board that has final signature authority, give yourself extra time to get those approvals in. And you can request, or the amendment requests are actually called change requests in our system, and that is also accessed through the grant record details page. And they do have to be signed by an authorizing official. So I try not to put folks in compliance, but unfortunately, sometimes it happens. If you haven't fulfilled a requirement, you will be placed in non-compliance. So if you haven't submitted your reports on time, if you don't respond to department requests for information in a timely manner, when you are in non-compliance, it's for the entire organization. So if you are a university that has multiple grants with us because you have multiple departments or entities that have grants under you, no one with that same FEIN can get a payment. It affects the entire organization. If you are in non-compliance for a long time and it doesn't get resolved, you could be required to return any funds that you've already been given, or we could just cancel the grant. So don't do that. I know no one's going to do that, but it does bear mentioning. Okay, so just some quick reminders. No expenditures before or after the grant period, but you can start spending money now because it's after July 1st. Payments are based on completion of the entire project, including grant and matching funds, and all of your documentation should reflect that. Make sure you keep a grant file, keep all the records, invoices, etc. for 10 years following the close of the grant. And of course, I am always here to help. For those of you who've worked with me before, you know I have a tendency to answer emails on evenings and weekends. I try not to, but it happens. I try to answer you as quickly as I can. I want to work with you, make sure that you're successful with your grant. I can't wait to see all your projects being finished. Wanted to mention, or actually just show you our logo really briefly. I did mention if you need a file of our logo, I'm happy to send it to you. We like the color ones best, of course. We have the horizontal and the vertical, but we do have ones that are just black. We also have ones that are just white if you're going to be putting on something that has a dark background, and the white would show up better. Okay, so that was a lot of information in a little bit of time. If you have any questions, be sure to put them in the question box. I see that there's already a question. Just to clarify, we are encouraged on the contract form to reduce the project budget to a 1-to-1 cash match to simplify the 30, 60, and 100% qualifiers. So it depends on what your match amount is actually. So if you're 1-to-1, I'm going to use numbers. So if you request $500,000 and your match is 1-to-1, try to keep your budget to $1 million. If your request is 500,000, but your match is 2 to 1. You want to try and keep your budget to around 1.5 million, just so that it's easier for you to achieve those benchmarks of 30, 60, and 100%. You get the funds quicker rather than if you put your entire $8 million project or $32 million project. You get to those benchmarks faster. So yes, that's correct. Are there any other questions? Okay, I don't see any. You may have questions later. Everyone has my email address, my phone number. I'm always happy to help. You will get a follow-up email with the link to the quiz. The recording will be available. You can actually access it through the registration link, but we're going to put it on our website as well, along with a copy of the slides. I will email a copy of the slides to everyone so that you have them for reference. And again, I know it's a lot, so just take it bit by bit and we'll work through it, get those contract details done as quickly as you can, and I'll get those contracts to you so that you can get them signed. And I look forward to working with you all. I hope you have a great day. Thank you so much.